Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the DTN Ag Summit Series event. I'm Farm Business Editor Katie Dehlinger. I am going to be your host today. I also had the honor all of last week of being the editor and one of the reporters on our Digital Yield Tour project. This is a project I've been helping to spearhead for the last 8 years since we started off our digital look at how crops are growing across the country. The Digital Yield Tour is something we're really proud of here at DTN, especially the past 2 years, because we've actually switched to using our own proprietary yield models developed by some of our data science team. I'm really looking forward to our first guest today, Scott Williams, who's going to be explaining how those yield models come together, how DTN looks at the crop modeling process different than other companies, and he's going to give us an updated look at where our models are looking at just as our latest run as of last Friday. We're going to follow that up with a really great look into our weather forecast with DTN ag meteorologist John Baranick. He's going to look at what's left in this growing season because one of the big questions out there is really how this crop is going to fill either because of too much water, not enough water, or something in between. So we are really going to look at that. And then we're going to take a bigger picture look at what all of this means for the commodity markets. Last week, USDA came out with a monster corn production forecast, 16.7 billion bushels, a national average yield of 188 bushels per acre on corn. It really just sent as good and big as that is, it was a little bit depressing out there in farm countries as farmers saw all their hard work end up in a pay cut or what appears to be a pay cut. So, DTN contributing analyst Todd Hultman will be joining us to explain a little bit about how that report impacts the markets, what we see as a grain outlook, grain marketing outlook going forward, some of the developments there. So, I'm really looking forward to the content we have this morning. We've got a wonderful lineup that I think will help you all set your businesses up for success in the next couple of months to come. So I want to go ahead and introduce our first guest. We have Scott Williams. He's one of DTN's data scientists. He actually comes from an entomology background in science. Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning, and I hope it is a wonderful morning wherever any of you are.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you about what goes into the crop yield model that I and others have worked on for many of years to bring it to be something that can power the digital yield tour. And let's get right into it.
Go for it.
Um,
I'm excited.
yeah, as most of you know by now, the USDA released its estimates for corn and soybean with the August 12th WASDE report. And as Katie said, by their estimates, we're looking at a record-breaking season for corn and close to it for soybeans. And these predictions matter to a broad group of stakeholders who use the information to make decisions and manage risk. Growers can decide when to harvest or how much storage that they're going to need at the end of the season. Food processors can locate from which regions to supply their raw ingredients, while banks and insurance companies can evaluate an area's risk and adjust loan and insurance rates. Now, traditionally, making these predictions relied on labor intensive surveys combined with in person scouting to determine what conditions in the field may be. The methodologies and results of this process has proven so successful that it makes the USDA the gold standard for crop yield predictions. However, only an organization with the backing of the US government could potentially field and coordinate the number of workers needed to collect these data on such a vast scale. On top of that, the report's release schedules do have a bit of a lag time, coming weeks or possibly months after the data was collected. And with the potential for declining response rates for survey questions, the reliability of these methods has somewhat diminished. Making yield predictions with machine learning, though, offers a potential alternative. These methods require fewer man hours, are repeatable, and focus on objective features from the data that is either publicly available or measurable with equipment. So with data that I've sourced from multiple sources, could potentially test again and again new methodologies for predicting crop yield and give us a better turnaround in terms of how quickly we can maybe come to something that is agreeable to what we're seeing on the ground. The models are also highly scalable, meaning that what may work on a small area can easily translate into larger regions around the country or to more crops without a lot of new investment into the system. But despite these advantages, predicting crop yield with machine learning does come with some challenges we have to overcome at DTN. Usually, any system that is a good candidate for machine learning is continually providing new data that can be used to train, test, and validate their models. Crop yield isn't like that. We only get a new batch of data once per year. And that means that we can only validate our model's performance after harvest and when and then must wait until the following growing season to see how our changes influenced our predictions. The data set for measuring crop yield is also a lot smaller than traditional modeling topics. Even if you included every county in the country for every year available, um, you would still only have data sets containing tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of data points. Other machine learning models instead have millions of data points. So we need to make sure that we both have good quality data and that we on the data science team are making good use of that data. There's also a question about how uniformly we can apply a given model across the country. Do we group Georgia with North Dakota in our corn model? Or are they so far apart geographically that it actually makes more sense to group them in separate models, expecting the model behavior to be different between them? And then lastly, the agriculture environment is always changing. In general, temperatures are rising and bringing with them shifts in other weather events, new rain patterns, the greater presence of wildfire smoke, and then a greater number of storm events with increasing intensity, which means that the growing seasons of a decade ago may not be good predictors for today's growing environment. So any model we produce needs to take this into account when we make our predictions. And screen, there we go, froze for a sec. Now, broadly speaking, the DTN crop yield model is broken up between its data sources and how we process that data. Because at the core of DTN's crop model is a blending of agronomic, satellite, and weather soil data that is used to generate our predictions. One key distinction of the model is what we use as our target data, the yield information that we use to tell the model whether they are making good predictions or bad predictions, and then use that as a feedback loop to tell them how to change and make better predictions the next run around. Now, thankfully for us, the USDA has two potential sources for yield: the National Agriculture and Statistics Service and the Risk Management Agency. The NASS data set contains the numbers most people associate with the WASDE report, and these figures are often the ones folks see first and remember. Final yield estimates are available by December, but because of the sampling methods used to obtain the data, they are still, at their core, estimates. The RMA dataset is based on insurance data, and it better represents actual yield in an area, even if that yield is biased towards insured acres. These numbers are reported much later, though, usually in June of the following growing season. Between these two sources, we at DTN use the RMA yields for our models rather than the NASS dataset. And that's because despite having the slower release schedule, the RMA yield dataset allows us to include a greater number of counties when training our models, as the NASS dataset tends to exclude counties that fall below certain production thresholds. And by being a better representation of quote unquote true yields for a county, we hope that the RMA dataset will train our model towards greater accuracy in its predictions. Now, we don't entirely ignore the NASS data set, though. From them, we can retrieve relevant agronomic data from either the QuickStats API or their gridded progress and condition data layers, which we use as features in our data set. This latter product provides weekly updates on the progress and condition of a given crop at a 9-kilometer resolution going back 10 years. This is convenient because it allows us to see what's with greater clarity how well a crop is progressing on the county level. But only corn, soybeans, cotton, and winter wheat are included in these data layers. So for models that are focused on, say, sorghum or other types of wheat, we have to look elsewhere. Unfortunately, for most of the states we're interested in, there are also state level condition and progress updates that we can apply to the county level. While this may not be as accurate as a gridded data set would be, it still provides the model with something to work with while training. And as we move on to our other data sets of satellite and weather and soil information, it's important to know that we have to be careful with handling that information so as to not mix non-crop with crop data in a county. The figure that you see on the slide here shows how land cover is partitioned between different crops over a given area. And if we want to model, say, corn, which is that golden yellow color on the screen, we want just the information that is relevant to the cornfields. We don't want to mix in soybeans, we don't want to mix in sugar beets, and we don't want to mix in non-crop land. So it'd be nice if we could just filter out all the irrelevant data and have only the corn related information left behind. Now, the USDA does release a map like this every year, but it's usually after the growing season has finished. So it doesn't help us much while we're in season. However, my colleague Rob Hale, also on the agronomic data science team, he has used the USDA's maps to produce our own DTN CDL using machine learning. We produced two versions of the CDL over the season. First, a preseason one that focuses primarily on predicting patterns in how crops are rotated from season to season, and therefore project where it's likely to be grown in the following year. And then this map is refined once we have satellite data come in that strengthens the case that a crop is growing in a specific field. The end goal is to match the USDA CDL for the same year, and the in-season model can categorize the different crops with an accuracy as high as up to 95%. And this is especially accurate in areas of the greatest growing activities, say corn and soybeans for Iowa and Illinois. And while the process for generating the DTN CDL produces usable and excellent results for our model purposes, it is still being refined and improved on. By next year, the expectation is that we'll have a product that has even greater accuracy than what we are currently using for 2025. And this all allows us to partition data sources like satellite information and getting to those crop exclusive information. Satellite data provides an excellent way to efficiently view large areas of cropland. And in previous years, our model gathered satellite data from the MODIS or Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer satellites. MODIS is a pair of satellite data sets that have a 20+ year history for mapping the Earth's surface, providing data regarding land surface temperature, land use, and most importantly for our uses, vegetative indices. We tend to use a normalized difference vegetative index, which is the difference between the amount of near infrared light, which tends to bounce off leaf surfaces, and the amount of red light, which is absorbed by plants during photosynthesis. And this is detected by the equipment and produces a value that can roughly translate to the amount of photosynthesis activity going on in an area. Areas with high differences between these two values are assumed to have greater leaf area cover or larger plants and greater health. And healthy plants are naturally assumed to be more likely to produce more seeds. So it's a good feature to use if you're wanting to predict yield totals. And though the MODIS data set has been useful for the model in the past, this is perhaps the biggest change in our models from previous years, as we have replaced the MODIS vegetative index with ones coming from the Harmonized Landsat Sentinel-2 or HLS satellite. Despite their shorter 8-year history, the HLS satellites provide greater spatial resolution down to 30 meters. And they also better handle cloud cover than MODIS, allowing us to potentially model down to the individual field level at some point in the future. It also helps that HLS data is more timely. This was a continual problem we had with MODIS in that updates to the data set could be delayed by as much as a month or 6 weeks, which diminished its value for making timely predictions. And then lastly, our last category of data that we use for the model, it comes from DTN's ClearAg API, which was acquired from Iteris in 2020. ClearAg provides gridded data at a 1 kilometer resolution for a number of crop relevant soil and weather features that we may want to include in the model, both at hourly and daily resolutions. Combined with the agronomic and satellite data, we end up with a pretty comprehensive picture of the crop's health and growing environment, allowing us to project where we think yield will end up at the end of the season. Now, despite what you may expect, working on the current season's model begins very early, all the way back in February, and then development covers most of the growing season leading up to prediction time. In February, we generate what we call preseason predictions, which are based off of projected trendline yields from the RMA dataset. Think of them as a bit of a placeholder prediction in which we factor in general trends and improving crop genetics, farming practices, and how they may impact crop yield. These preseason numbers are included in DTN's new grain intelligence platform and also give us a starting point for reviewing model performance once we generate our in-season model predictions. Between March and June, we enter a cycle of data ingestion and model refinement. With so many potential inputs to use from our data sources, it can be hard to govern how we select the features we want to use for a model. That's why every year's model is governed by a set of documents that let us define the feature data sets and the model parameters we want to use. This makes it easier for us to quickly look into a new model method for modeling and to keep track about how we set it up for later review. As for how the model is trained, the nuances can get a little different from model to model, but the general principle is that during the training step, we have a target true value for a county's yield. And then we have all the associated feature data, the satellite, the weather, the crop condition information. We then tell the model to find associations between the changes in the feature data and the changes in the yield values from county to county. Then we take what that model has learned and expose it to a new set of feature data and tell it to predict the associated yield. If the model makes reasonably close predictions, it's given feedback to make small changes in its parameters, as it already has a good idea of the relationship between the features and yield. If, however, the model takes wildly inaccurate predictions, then the model is told to make large leaps in its changes because, yeah, a 200 bushel difference is nowhere close. This happens hundreds to thousands of times over the course of training, fine-tuning the model's understanding of the data and how it associates with yield, with the hope that it will finally settle on an approach that gives us consistently good predictions. This is also the time that we explore the different types of machine learning models we use. Any given approach has its strengths and weaknesses. You have your random forests, you have your gradient boostings, you have your simple linear regressions. Some might be good at modeling within the range of data used for training, but fail to accurately predict extreme events because they are so rare. Others may be good at catching these extreme events, but are too well tuned to them, so most predictions end up being extreme. So instead of using just one, we actually generate predictions with several machine learning methods. Each set of predictions are compiled together and then the results are combined as a weighted average into what we call an ensemble prediction. This is what we actually publish as our final set of figures when we get to our prediction dates. And the result is a model that may be more conservative and less likely to throw out outlier values, but it should still shift towards direction the crop is moving in terms of yield. Lastly, I'll touch upon the timing of when we generate our predictions. We currently model 6 crops over the course of the season: winter, durum, and spring wheat, along with corn, soybeans, and sorghum. Because of when the USDA makes its reports, we want to predict at time points that will be ahead of the USDA. And so we currently have a monthly release schedule, which is shown on the table in the slide. Boxes highlighted in yellow are months for which we have trained models for that given crop, with the 3 wheat crops having predictions generated earlier than corn, soybean, and sorghum. We regularly update these predictions over the course of the season, month to month, until the crops harvest, at which point we just sort of give it a rest and begin preparing for the next season. But that gets us to sort of the conclusion of the broad overview on how the modeling process works. And now we can get into what I'm sure all of you are actually here for, which is our updated predictions. If you were following the digital yield tour last week, you likely saw this map or ones like it. This map represents our corn predictions as of August 1st, 2025. And what I mean by that is the following. The model is taking all available data from the beginning of the season through the end of July, and then making county level predictions for the end of the season, which usually is around October, November, depending on where it is in the country. Because the features we use for making predictions cover such a broad area, we're actually capable of generating predictions even for counties that usually get left out from yield data sets. An example is, say, you have 2 growers that happen to produce corn in a county that tends not to produce corn. They may not even have their crop insured, so they're being left out of the RMA data set. But the CDL that we produce can pick up that these crops exist. And not only that, we can then assign satellite data to it, weather and soil data, and maybe even use the state average conditions to build a model for this particular county. And so we can actually make predictions for counties that would otherwise be dropped out. And that gives us a more complete picture of what's going on around the country. Lastly, I want to just also emphasize one limitation of the models, which is that for events that occur after the cutoff date or may have a delayed effect. For example, we had flooding in Wisconsin earlier this month, but that came after our August 1st cutoff point. So the data that event wouldn't show up in our model features. So there could be times where the model may not agree with the observations on the ground as we see them. But regardless, it does serve as a great snapshot in time as what the harvest could look like if conditions continue to progress at their current trajectory. So let's now look at some numbers. Here at the table to the right, I have our statewide average predictions for all 11 states included in the digital yield tour. And that second column is the August 1st predictions that were published as part of the tour. The third column is our new updated estimates as of August 15th. The fourth contains the estimates from last week's WASDE report. And the final column is the state level 5-year average from 2020 to 2024 to give us some context. Now, since August 1st, the model has moved up its predicted yield for the national number for a number of states as well. Right now, the model is almost identical to the WASDE's national number of 188 bushels per acre, projecting it to be 188.5. And we're seeing the biggest shifts upward in Kansas, North Dakota, and South Dakota, increasing between 4 to 7 bushels per acre from our previous estimates. We do have a few states that are predicting yields that are lower than USDA predictions. But of these, currently only Minnesota is the only one that has actually declined between our August 1st and August 15th models, though that could be attributed to noise in the data set and may not actually be a true indication of yield decline. Wisconsin has also seen a slight drop from our August 1st forecast, though it is still well above the USDA's prediction of 185 bushels per acre for corn in the state. So, if anything, it's probably the model regressing to the mean and going towards a more average prediction rather than a true sign of yield decline in the state. Soybeans has likewise moved up since our August 1st predictions, though they still remain almost a bushel below the WASDE's national number of 53.6 bushels per acre. Currently, we're seeing a predicted national average of 52.8 bushels per acre, which isn't too far off. And again, we're seeing increased yields forecasted for Kansas, the Dakotas, while Minnesota and Wisconsin lag behind the USDA's forecasts. And that actually leads us to a very important question. When we're seeing consistent patterns in multiple states across different crops, why exactly does the model make the predictions that it does? You see, one of the challenges of machine learning that I didn't bring up earlier is that for many approaches, how a model makes its decision can be a bit of a black box. These methodologies are using mathematical relationships within the data and feedback loops to make its estimations. And even if we were to dive into those equations, it may not always result in an answer that is easy to interpret. But we can focus on specific elements of our model to infer why it's providing the predictions it does. So, for example, for both corn and soybeans, our model generally associates higher yield with higher levels of soil moisture and higher crop condition scores. And if we review the Digital Yield Tours articles from last week, we do see a consistent pattern emerging from the discussion. Rainfall was regular but light and steady through the season. Temperatures were mild, and even if there were hot stretches, they alternated with cool ones. And the USDA rated corn and soybean crops highly this year in multiple states, which would definitely drive the model up. Given that Kansas and the Dakotas are often states that experience dry, hot conditions, seeing consistently favorable conditions outside of the norm makes it easy to see why the model would be very bullish with them and would take those values and run with them with higher yield predictions. So we see how this could help us understand why some states are seeing good improvements as time goes on for the model. But what does that tell us about soybeans in Minnesota and Wisconsin? Why are they lagging behind the USDA? And I'll be honest, this is something that is a little harder to tell. For states that we also modeled, like Indiana and Missouri, we kind of have a clearer understanding of what is driving some lower yield predictions for them. In Indiana, the season got off to a late start, failed to see consistent favorable conditions like the Dakotas. And likewise, we see divergence in growing conditions between the north of a state like Missouri, which saw good growing conditions, while the south tended to see late season planting that caused shallow root growth, and which may bring down the state's average overall, even though it had good growing conditions up at the top of the state. But aside from the flooding that I mentioned earlier in Wisconsin, whose effects should not appear even with our August 15th model just yet, both Minnesota and Wisconsin saw many of the same favorable conditions that the Dakotas did. Dry early springs, which led to moderately warm summers with frequent light rainfall. Even the storm systems that cut across the upper plains would not have had nearly the same effect in these states. So we need to dig into the data a bit more to see hints of what the model is actually picking up on and what's driving its choices. On this slide, we have plots of two soil features that we can potentially use in the model. These are soil moisture at the depth of between 0 and 10 centimeters, and soil moisture at the depth from 0 to 200. And we have included here both Dakotas, Minnesota, as well as Wisconsin. Now, I'll preface this by saying these are statewide averages, so we are sacrificing some county level nuances in order to simplify the narrative that I'm trying to get at. But starting with the figure to the left, what we see is that for all four states, they follow the same general pattern week over week, leading to the August 1st cutoff. They dip down at week 28, showing drier conditions, and then begin to rise for weeks 29 and 30. But it's after this point that we see a divergence. While the Dakotas continue to increase in value for the soil moisture for the first 2 weeks of August, Minnesota and especially Wisconsin start to decline. And even if we look at the second figure, which measures a greater volume of soil and therefore should have fewer large jumps from data point to data point, we still see that the same pattern exists. The Dakotas rise week over week, while Wisconsin and Minnesota, to a lesser extent, start to taper off. So there are two possible explanations for why our model isn't boasting the same yields as the USDA. One is that the model is picking up something like the soil moisture feature that the USDA and grain experts have not. And that might be signaling to the model to predict lower yields. The other is just maybe that our model is built to be too conservative for Minnesota and Wisconsin. And that's certainly plausible. It's only going to be when the harvest totals finally come in the fall that we'll have a better position to decide which of these is the correct interpretation of what was going on, and then adjust our model accordingly. So before we get to the wrap up, I would like to just touch on a few areas where the model has room to grow in terms of what we can take into account on their effects of crop yield. One is, while there's no consensus yet on how wildfire smoke is impacting yield broadly, the literature on the topic is growing. The concern is that wildfire smoke could reduce solar radiation enough to have a significant effect on yield. And so including changes in solar radiation reaching the ground may be a feature that will be needed to be added to the model if wildfire continues to be a broad environmental condition during the growing season. Also, increasing temperatures are also affecting the traditional dynamics between crops and their pests. Warmer temperatures result in greater numbers of crop pests, while wetter conditions can spur on the development of funguses and mold. And while these impacts can be picked up by some of the current model features, such as NDVI and crop condition, these proxies may not be capturing the full picture. And so further development could be useful. And then lastly, on the other end of the scale are changes in the tools and practices producers use for farming. Even if the conditions are trending towards what the model would expect to be a result in negative effects on yield, producers, if they get the information early enough, may be able to defeat that prophecy. They could use improved fungicides or other practices to blunt these effects. And therefore, just as the farmer is catching up to the ever-shifting growing environment of their crop, so too does the model have to catch up with these growers if they want to provide accurate information. So to wrap up, machine learning models provide a solution to the challenges for accurately estimating crop yield. At DTN, we're able to provide our customers projections at the state and county level up to more than a week ahead of the USDA WASDE report. And there are plans to also provide field level estimations in the future. These models are constantly evolving, and we are always refining our process to create something that is more accurate and more timely. And we look forward to providing this better product in the future. But that's about all I have to share for today. I really appreciate you giving me the time to share a project that I've been working on for years, and I'll look forward to your questions later on when the time comes. But thank you very much and have a good day.
Well, thank you, Scott. That was all really, really interesting. And I learned things and I've been covering these with you and learning from you for a while now. I did get a question from Todd Hultman, one of our analysts who's going to be speaking a little later today. He wanted to ask you any idea how much fall weather could still move the needle in some of these predictions? How quickly can our models respond to some of the changing conditions that are out there?
So it really is going to come down to some of the unique characteristics of the crops themselves. If these late season effects have, for like for example, happen after a lot of the grain filling has already completed, they're only going to cause issues if they prevent equipment from getting into the field. Um, Others, but if they do happen during that critical period where you have maybe a lot of stressful environments, flooding, for example, or hot temperatures, that could be still something that could have an effect and will probably pare down the model's results. It does tend to be responsive to these types of things, especially if they're also being showing up in crop condition estimations from the USDA, which is a feature that gets weighted pretty generously within the model.
Okay. Another question is sort of asking you a little bit about what's the margin of error for these forecasts? Have you really worked that out and have sort of that statistical understanding of these models?
So obviously, we can only make assumptions of it when it comes to the current season, but when it comes to previous seasons, what we tend to see is on the state level, sometimes the margin of error can be about usually like an 8 to 10 bushel per acre for corn, usually more like a 3 to 5 bushel per acre for soybeans. This obviously varies from state to state, and this is, I should make sure I had it clear, the state level estimate. Once we get to the county level, the variability does get higher because sometimes counties' conditions just don't have as much data on them. So a small change can have a much wider shift in what the model is projecting for that county. But for the ones that tend to be our most heavily produce, or I should say, highest producing areas, the error does tend to be much more reserved, and even on the county level, doesn't tend to vary too wildly, more like a 15 bushel per acre, plus or minus, depending on how the model shakes out.
So that's really the benefit of math that you have when you have more numbers all informing that larger one, you can get to a much more confident estimate.
Exactly.
Okay. Kind of another question on the math side. You touched on the difference of our model being trained on RMA's data versus NASA's data. How do those numbers tend to differ at the county level, if farmers are looking at those?
So it again depends on the county and the crop. Usually there's not that much difference. Part of the reason that we ended up with RMA is because, like I said earlier, we could encompass a much larger number of counties than what we could get from the NAS data set. And because they were considered to be a better representation of true yield, we wanted to use that. Another reason why we even explored the RMA data set was that for a brief window of time, it was looking like the USDA was going to discontinue county level estimates for crop yield entirely. And so we needed to have this shift to another data set that was going to be reliable and dependable. And once we had already made that shift, we realized there was a benefit to using it over NAS because of the greater body of data and better confidence that what we're seeing was true. Usually, differences would be maybe 1 to 5 bushels per acre at most. But We could also get into more nuances with the RMA data set because we could get estimates of the irrigated yield versus the non-irrigated yield. And that was something that could be potentially useful for us if we wanted to tell a grower specifically for their situation, if they used one practice or another, how that was going to impact their overall yield for the season.
That's really interesting. One thing I had observed when reporting on these stories was that in Nebraska, they're chronically one of the highest yielding counties is Phelps County, Nebraska, and it was one of the highest this year. But I also know they have a lot of irrigation there. And so that was It's interesting. Our models tend to pull that out.
Mhm.
Yeah. One question, you mentioned the difference between the MODIS and the HLS models. Are those the ones that when farmers or anyone hears about NDVI, the normatized differential vegetation index maps, is that where those come from, or is that a separate input?
So yeah, I think this is something that I'll have to double check, but I do believe that is a source that can provide them. Modus, like I said, has been going on for 20 years, has a great body of data that covers um, the country, and so it makes sense that this would be one of the sources for it. As I said, HLS provides greater spatial resolution, and for that reason, it's giving us a ability to be more targeted and more nuanced with the model data when we want to partition out the information that is relevant to the given crop.
You mentioned that our models are constantly improving. You go through that summer of training things. You try to incorporate new data every year. What are some of the things that are next that you're going to work on in this off season on bringing into the model?
So some of the things that we're interested in looking at is looking at things related to, and I've had it just off the top of my tip of my tongue, but solar radiation, for example, I brought up the wildfire conditions. Now, this is one of those conditions that we need to first do a correlation to make sure that in the time frames that we see the greatest wildfire smoke cover moving across a region, does that correlate to what our solar radiation feature is picking up? If we see corresponding changes to solar radiation as the wildfires, then that means that we have the potential to make a good step in incorporating it as a feature. Also, we are looking at maybe changing uh, exactly how we process certain data features. One thing that I showed with soil moisture is that we use a concept called z-scores, which is basically just looking at the deviation of soil moisture from what is considered to be typical for that area at a point in time. But that may not necessarily be the only way we can look at that data set. And so we can look at other things. And then finally, we talked about NDVI, but there are also other vegetative indices like EVI, enhanced vegetative indices. That could provide us with a way of looking at the crop when it gets to sort of like its maximum extent, because NDVI does have the potential to become saturated in a given area. And EVI might be able to help us really push the model to see more extreme events as we move forward.
Now, right now, it's the way people can see DTN's yield models are through the DTN yield tour, but I'm okay sharing here. We're talking a little bit about how we're going to build those into upcoming DTN products, our DTN Ag Hub. I want to have our production manager, Susan's going to drop a link in the chat of where you can follow along for updates on when some of those new products will be released. We'll be updating our website and including Scott's work into our yield models almost to that very narrow forecast for the 2026 season. So before I send you on your way, Scott, do you have any other thoughts or anything else our viewers need to keep in mind when they're looking at yield models more broadly or curious about what DTN is doing?
So I would say that one thing to always keep in mind when looking at the results of any model, whether it's DTNs, the WASD report, is just remember that things can change. I mentioned them several times that we could have late season effects that could really make things harder on the crop. Harvesting could be delayed. We can also say that maybe growers step up and make the right choices at the right time. And that's kind of the reason why we work on the model in the first place, is that we want to give growers information that will allow them to make appropriate management decisions that will ultimately allow them to squeeze the most yield out of their production with the least amount of inputs. And hopefully, that information will become more and more useful for DTN's customers.
Well, Scott, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Very interesting updates. Interesting to learn that, how the models change over time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and now we're going to get to the next topic of the day, which is what could happen in that late season growing season. We know that last year had a big impact on what the crop looked like. We saw that as crops after our digital yield tour, things got a little dry, they got a little hot, and it took a little bit off the top end of grain fill. So I am looking forward to bringing in our next guest. He is DTN ag meteorologist John Baranick. He's going to take a look forward at some of the forecasts for this year. And I just want to remind you all, please drop any questions you have for any of our guests in the Q&A. We will do a joint Q&A with John and Todd after their presentation. So please just drop them into that Q&A chat when you get a chance. And John, welcome back to the Ag Summit series.
Yeah, it's good to be back, and it's really interesting to hear from Scott how that model works because I'm sure everybody now has heard a bunch of different model numbers from different sources, and okay, what goes into that? What are they looking at? So it's really cool to see from Scott there, kind of how DTN is doing it. And so I mean, he kind of mentioned about how the weather has kind of played into that a little bit. I think we want to dive into that a little bit here, Katie, at first, just to kind of give us an idea of, okay, I mean, all these models are seen high, and a lot of us were in shock, I think, about just how high the WASD number came out. And then, obviously we put our number out there too. It was pretty close. So I think it'll be good to kind of go over a little bit of why that weather or what went into that first, and then we'll go into the season a little bit, if that's all right.
Sounds great. Take it away.
Okay, so we'll do that. So you look at a little bit of the just the recent temperatures and precipitation here, and I'm just going to talk about just the summer. And so I mean, really, when things got going here, everybody was in the ground generally at the beginning of June. So looking from June onward here. We're just taking a look at the temperatures, the average temperatures here, and this actually includes on the left here the next 2 weeks as well. But when you average it all out, I mean, those plain states where we thought it was going to be very hot this summer have not been. They've been actually very average in terms of temperature. So I mean, you go from the Dakotas all the way down to Texas. And yeah, sure, it's a little bit above normal in some spots, but basically we were right on normal. It's actually the eastern half of the Corn Belt and down into the southeast where we had issues with more intense heat, longer heat. If you live in those areas, you probably notice the humidity has been pretty awful as well. And so we've had a few more issues in terms of heat in the eastern half of the Corn Belt this year. When we look at the precipitation, I mean, this map is very telling to me, going back the last 2 months, about just how much precipitation we've gotten. Usually when we look at a map for this length of period of time, you see a lot of that orangey color there where we're below normal, and some streaks or blotches where we've got above normal green. But you look at the vast majority of the Corn Belt, and even going up into the Canadian prairies. You go from the Canadian prairies all the way through Iowa, northern Missouri, and Illinois, and it's just solid green in there. So we've had a lot of rain in a lot of these areas, and it also extends down into Kansas. Scott mentioned that as well. As you know, we've had very steady and consistent rainfall in Kansas, which we usually don't see during the summertime. Usually they tend to go a little bit hotter and drier, and they just didn't. They were very normal in terms of temperature, and they've had some very good rainfall and steady and consistent over the period of the summer. That's really helped them out. Where we've kind of seen that kind of tick back a little bit, especially recently, is in that kind of lower Mississippi Valley, Mid-South area, and even portions of the Eastern Corn Belt. So to go along with some additional heat, we've also had less coverage of heavy precipitation. More light events are getting missed completely, and those really show up there in the map on the right. But you take the season as a whole here, or the summer season as a whole up until now, and we kind of do a ranking here. This is from my friends at Iowa State. I'm an alum, so I happen to love this map. But you take the last from June 1st until yesterday, and you can take that and rank it in terms of, okay, where do we sit as far as normal? And anything in white is near normal. So over the last 133 years, anywhere from 50 to 65 would be very average. Anything in that blue shaded is a little cooler than normal. So some of the Dakotas and Montana, and even down in Texas and Oklahoma, have actually been a little cooler than normal. But then you look at the Eastern Corn Belt, and it really sticks out there. Indiana and especially Ohio. Ohio's basically had a top 10 summer in terms of heat this year, even portions of Michigan as well. So we've had some issues here, especially in the Eastern Corn Belt with the heat. In terms of precipitation, though, I mean, it kind of mirrors what I showed on the map a couple times ago. I mean, we've had some very wet conditions, but just how wet? Well, some of these have had, a top 5 year. These are climate districts. And some of these climate districts have had a top 5 summer season in terms of rainfall. There's several there in Iowa. There's one in northeast South Dakota and western Minnesota. But I mean, a lot of this is in the top 25, top 50 of precipitation over the last 133 years. So it's actually been a very wet summer for a lot of folks. The areas that you're seeing where that's not really the case is down in that Delta region, and then kind of in some areas of the Eastern Corn Belt. So portions of Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. But then when you get down to the south as well, especially kind of along the lower Mississippi River, we've had some issues with dryness. Not to mention all those areas out in the west where it's been extremely dry. Some of them have had the driest summers on record. Usually they're getting some precipitation via some monsoon type thunderstorms, but they've been very, very weak this year. So we've got a lot of dry conditions out west too, and that might play an important role going forward as well. So we'll keep that in mind too. But when we look at kind of the accumulated rainfall, and this is basically you take all the areas that have corn growing in it, and you add up all their moisture throughout, and you kind of average it over everywhere. That black line there is what is normal over the last 20 years. And the blue line is actually last year, and the red line is this year. And there's some subtle differences in there if you look at it. Last year, if you go back to July 1st of last year, we had some really good rainfall in early July, and then it kind of started to peter out at the end of July. And really in August, we had kind of a jump there in early August, but it was very dry through a lot of August. This year in the red, it's been a very steady incline in that precipitation all throughout the summer. And so we haven't had these really significant dry periods when you average it across the entire corn growing areas. Even the forecast there for the next 2 weeks, which is between those two vertical lines, still has some pretty decent precipitation coming in. So we've had, I think a steadier rainfall than we have last year, even though we're kind of sitting at the same amount of rain over the course of the 2 seasons, but both are very well above average. You also notice after this period, so after those 2 vertical lines, that blue line really went flat, which means we didn't get a whole lot of precipitation there in September, and then especially in October as well. And that really led to some drought conditions. And Katie mentioned how that took the top off the yield, so that can still happen even though we're at a good spot now. And so we'll looking at that closely. But you look at the drought monitor right now, and it's hard to argue about good weather conditions across most of the country. You look east of the Rockies, and it's some blotches, and it's mostly of that D0 abnormal dryness. It's not the significant drought that is really impacting crop production. It's a lot of that annoyance dryness stuff, but those do have a significant impact, especially when the momentum is building toward that. Last year at this time, we were kind of doing the same thing. We were very white across much of the Corn Belt, but we were starting to see those pockets start showing up here in the mid to late August time period, and that really accelerated in September and October. But yeah, I mean, you look at how we've come over the course of the last 10 weeks. So basically from the start of June, we had a lot of lingering drought still in the western half of the Corn Belt, and we've basically eliminated almost all of that. Some of those areas in Nebraska, especially, were in that D2, D3 drought and are now have nothing on the board. So we're sitting in a good spot, I think, for a lot of folks. But there are some lingering issues out there and some areas that we're going to need to be watching a little bit more closely than others through the end of the season yet. One other way to kind of look at this is just how much of that corn area has been in drought over the course of the last year. And I'm showing here back all the way to June of last year. If you know, from June through August of last year, it was very flat. Drought wasn't growing, but it wasn't shrinking. We didn't have a whole lot of it anyway, but then it really significantly took off in the fall. You contrast that a little bit with the right-hand side of this graph, and we've got we had some drought actually in June, but we were steadily decreasing that. We had enough rain that we kept decreasing the drought, so that builds momentum toward all that soil moisture being around for later. Whereas in last year, we were just kind of hanging on and doing okay until it started to get dry, and that became an issue. This year, we've built momentum towards being wet, and that can carry us forward a little bit, even if it does get a little bit drier. So we'll keep that in mind as well. I mean, and you look at the last 6 months, this is all just computer generated from the Drought Monitor website, and anywhere in that green or blue is significantly wet, and obviously the orange areas are suffering some sort of drought in the mid-range. And really, east of the Rockies, the only areas you can find is in southwestern Michigan and maybe northeastern North Dakota as having anything significant being in that drought over the last 6 months. We've done a very good job here of getting enough rainfall in a lot of areas. Even in the short term, over the course of a month or 2 months here, that dryness starts to pop up there in the mid-south, maybe some portions of Ohio, but of course in the Delta region as well. But overall, I mean, you look at Iowa, the top producing state. We've got a really large number for that. So does USDA. I mean, it can't look any better in terms of wetness across that area. Now, there are some issues that can come with the wetness. We all know that drowning out of spots is an issue. We could have nitrogen loss that, our models are not going to see from the top down, since that comes from the bottom up. So there are some issues that may plague that. But when you get this kind of coverage and it's not that purple everywhere, if we had that purple color that was exceptionally wet, we might be a little bit more concerned. But since we only have pockets of that darker blue, honestly, this is looking really good from a weather standpoint for a lot of areas, and especially around Iowa and northwestward through the northern plains. And so when you kind of put together some other things that the drought monitor puts together, and you come up with flash drought. So these are the areas that we're a little bit more concerned about flash drought occurring. Some of those are in Ohio. We got a couple spots in Indiana and Illinois, but really it's that mid-south Delta region that we're the most concerned about flash drought really affecting the latter stages of fill here, because they'll be starting to get the combines out pretty shortly here over the next couple of weeks. So even if they do have a little bit of drought down there, it might not be all that concerning, but this is just kind of showcases what's already happened towards the later stages of their fill period, and we could be seeing some issues there. A little bit more than other spots in the Corn Belt that we've been looking at and look pretty darn green. Over the last 15 days, we've had another heavy rainfall event across southern Minnesota. I don't think this really captures how much rain actually fell over southern Minnesota and into southeastern Wisconsin. Scott already mentioned kind of some of the heavy rainfall events that have happened that could be impactful there, and drowning out some areas that might not show up on satellite for a little bit. So there are some subtle issues in there, but I mean that's a good soaking rain over the last 2 weeks. You want to see those oranges. That would be about an inch per week here over the 15-day period. Anything in orange looks great. Anything else is a little on the low side. And again, that area pops out, the lower Mississippi Valley, that Delta region, up through some portions of the Eastern Corn Belt, where we may have some issues kind of developing. Not that they're there yet, but they might be developing for the later stages of that crop. This is looking at subsoil moisture now. So not just the topsoil, but what our storage capacity is. And you look at, again, Iowa up through Minnesota and the Dakotas, even eastern Nebraska, and lots of Kansas, lots of blue in there. And then so if it does start to turn dry here, we're going to end up okay. We've got a good enough subsoil moisture built up that we can sustain ourselves for a while. But when you get kind of that arc there from the lower Mississippi Valley up through the Eastern Corn Belt, it's a little drier. So we're going to need more consistent, steady rains going forward, especially since the last 2 weeks have been a little bit on the dry side. And I'm sure there's some folks on the call that are probably like, yeah, we're going to need some rain here pretty quick. So we'll be looking at that very closely. So before we get into the forecast, what's it going to look like? The one thing really that we're really focused on what's going to be driving weather for the fall and into the winter season is what's happening with El Nino and La Nina. If you look at that blue box on the right, and that's the region we look at to kind of designate whether we're in an El Nino or La Nina or neither. And you go back to March, and we've been waffling up and down in between neutral for the entire season, really back going from March all the way till now. The last couple of weeks, we've really started to kind of dip a little bit, and that'll be interesting going forward. But overall, we've had such an active pattern because we haven't had stable conditions. It's been very unstable in the Pacific Ocean. They're waffling back and forth. And so that's really helped to keep this pattern very active. We've had a couple of stagnant time periods there where we've had a stretch of hot weather and some drier conditions, but overall, this up and down pattern has really been a good one to keep the weather very active. Again, that dip down is going to be important though, because we're starting to head down towards something that looks a little bit more like La Nina here for the fall. So the model's been doing this for a while. Not just this is our American CFS model, but a bunch of other models across the world have taken hold of this as well. And we've got, hold on one second. My dog is starting to tear up something in the background. The joys of working from home, right? Anyway, so we've got this trend of lower temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. That looks like that's going to continue here as we go through the fall season. This model is a little bit more aggressive of getting us into a La Nina this fall by November and into December, before getting us back up into the neutral category over the winter towards spring. So it looks like this is going to be on the cards. What does that mean, though? Generally, what we usually see with a developing La Nina during the fall season is usually above normal temperatures and less frequent precipitation. So that dries things out. Now, notice that this doesn't really get into effect until we get into that October time period. So September is still kind of on the fence. So this will be interesting kind of looking forward here. Over the, and I apologize for these maps, but this is just the way DTN produces these maps. But just looking at the rest of August here, we've got a significant cold front coming through this weekend into next week. And we'll be getting a massive blob of cooler air that's going to feel like fall for a lot of us. I don't think we're going to see any frost. I would still say non-zero chance of that up in the Dakotas in northwestern Minnesota. But in general, it's really hard to do that in August. So I don't think this is going to be the event to do it. But we could see some upper 30s for lows up there in the Dakotas here this weekend. But so it'll be a very substantial drop in temperature. I think that's going to be a lot of good news for some of us. We're worried a little bit about harvest or fill period yet, and we could use a little less stress on some of those areas that are drier. So we've got that significant cold front moving through, but rainfall the rest of the month is not looking overly heavy here for a lot of us in the Corn Belt. We do have a front out there right now. It is producing some showers from Kansas into Michigan this morning. That will be dropping south into kind of the Tennessee Valley for tomorrow, and then kind of getting stalled out in the southeast. That front that brings through all that cold air doesn't look like it's going to have a whole lot of precipitation with it, unfortunately, as it moves across the Corn Belt. Although, if you're in the plains, so anywhere from western Nebraska down through Texas, we've got a much better chance there of picking up actually some moderate or even heavy rainfall as we start to finish up the crop down that way. And you look at the anomaly map there at the bottom right, and really we're looking at below normal precipitation here to close out August. So not kind of what we wanted to see. I guess the temperatures are nice to have some cooler nights, especially, but some cooler days ahead. A little bit more comfortable to be outside for sure. But that below normal precipitation is not what we want to see here at the end of August. So kind of following a little bit of the pattern like last year, where we had this dry period in August, and that might be a little bit concerning, especially for those out in the Eastern Corn Belt. But at least for the rest of us, we have some momentum to kind of carry us forward into September. And then when you look at kind of that August through October period where we're finishing up the crop, what's that look like? Just from a seasonal standpoint, we're looking at above normal temperatures and below normal precipitation for a lot of us. I don't like using these maps to talk a whole lot about it. I like the monthly maps a little bit better. In August, with that cool burst here coming next week, we're really going to end up actually average. It's kind of an interesting way to look at things, right? Because we were very hot in the beginning half of the month, and we're going to be very cool at the end of the month, so that kind of just averages itself out. But you look at the precipitation there, and we've got some issues, right? The Western Corn Belt, okay, far Western Corn Belt, okay, but you look at the even Central and Eastern Corn Belt, and we're drying out here in August, so it's not what we'd like to see. The good news is that September, while we're in that kind of transition going into that La Nina period, we have some opportunity for getting a little bit more precipitation in across, especially the northern half of the Corn Belt. But even the central and southern will have their chances going forward as well. If we add up everything, it looks like it's going to be a hot September, but I think this is going to come with a lot of variability. We'll see some significant heat ahead of a cold front. Cold front will come through. We'll go back down to normal, and then after a couple of days, it'll heat up again. Those fronts will bring through some plenty of opportunity for precipitation, and we've got some potential here in September. If you're worried about filling into September, I think we've got some ability yet to add on another couple of good rainfall events for you. And then when we get to October, things really start drying out. There is that little patch there in the Ohio Valley that looks a little bit wetter. I don't know if that's going to pan out or not. Usually when we see October's going into La Nina, it gets very hot and dry in October. And that's going to be very interesting to watch going forward for the winter season as well. But we can talk about that at a different event. But for as we start to get our combines out and we start rolling, especially as we get through October, I think we're going to be in some good shape going forward for that. Still, a lot of things can happen, right? We dodged one bullet from Hurricane Erin, which is going to miss the U.S. We're just entering the peak of hurricane season, so any of these can be these forecasts can be destroyed by a hurricane moving through. Luckily, we have that cold pool of air next week is going to shield us from potentially another one next week, but we're going to have to keep watching that through September and October, as that could mess with things. Later in the season there, when we get into November, we'll have to worry about stuff coming up from the Gulf of Mexico a little bit more. But things can always change with this. It's just that overall, this is kind of what we're looking at. We still have some opportunity to fill at the end of the season here. But when we get to October, it should be drying out pretty good, and we should be able to roll, I think, with very few interruptions in that. So that is all I have for you, Katie. I think we'll toss it over to you and talk to Todd a little bit before we come back for some Q&A.
Thank you, John. Those were all quite interesting. I found that short-term composite map to be really interesting, looking at where that soil moisture is. That eastern half of Nebraska, that eastern half of South Dakota looked so good. as far as their soil moisture profiles. I know that's where some of the on the ground tours have been scouting and posting just absolutely pictures of beautiful corn cobs all over X. It's going to be an interesting season to watch. I think the forecast for dryness is definitely a concern, especially when we look at some soybeans on that eastern Corn Belt side. That's where they've had it rough this year.
Yeah, well, and rough is kind of a
Right.
uh,
Relative. Relative.
relative, yeah, relatively speaking. I mean, we still have good numbers out there. I mean, you looked at the summer map in terms of where we rank, and we're still ahead of normal in a lot of those spots, or above normal in terms of precipitation in a lot of those spots. It just hasn't been as frequent, and it hasn't been lately. So, the end of the season might have some issues, but when you looked through July, a lot of that, and I was kind of looking at July in specific, I didn't put any numbers up here, but the July period was actually very wet across the vast majority of the Corn Belt. So getting uh, the pollination issues we've been seeing, I think are a little bit more on the scattered and sporadic side, which some places are going to get issues with that at some point, but I think in general we should be pretty decent in a lot of areas. So we'll see how that all comes out when the combines roll and farmers actually get out there and should give us the numbers. But overall, I think we're still in a good shot in a good spot, even if we're ending in a poor spot there in the Eastern Corn Belt.
All right. Thank you so much, John. I appreciate that. And if you guys out in the audience have questions for John or for Todd Hultman, please drop them in the Q&A. We're going to be moving on now to take a really good look at what all this means for the grain markets, what this means for your marketing plans. I'm happy to bring back to the webinar DTN contributing analyst Todd Hultman. Todd, wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you, Katie. Really nice to be back. Very happy to say Rhett's been doing a good job, but he took a little break here and well deserved. And so I'm glad to fill in. And hello, everybody.
Yeah, well, I'm really interested in what you have to say and what your thoughts are on this WASDE report, on John's weather forecast, what all this means for our growers out there. So take it away.
Well, yeah, thank you. Here we are again, second year in a row, extremely low prices, very tough market environment for farmers this year. Once again, this seems to be a common theme when we go to the farm shows in the fall. I remember last year at Boone, Iowa, I think the Farm Progress show, we were near the lows in corn at the time, and it seems to be that the time, that we go out and talk about the markets and get some attention. So hate to see this situation rise again, but I'll explain it the best I can and try to offer my best of how to get through this. So let's go ahead and dig in. Over the summer, many of the topics remain the same, except the new one, which John and Scott have pointed out already. This year, the Midwest is largely drought-free. We haven't seen that for a long time. And as John was describing, the conditions for crops, very, very good this year. It's very difficult to argue with that. Probably the only issue, if there is any issue on people's minds, maybe was some of the early pollination concerns. I think overall, we're probably going to find out that it's a non-event in terms of just how good the rest of the crop is. We won't. Well, I'll get into that later, but I'm really looking forward to the field estimates or the field-based data that USDA will include in their estimates in September. I think that'll be really important to confirm basically what we're seeing as very big successful crops this year. The Fed policy remains hawkish. We still have interest rates at a higher level. That's tough on the ag economy. There may be some modest hope for that ahead, but I don't see a drastic change coming anytime soon in the interest rate policy. Currently, the non-commercial traders remain short in corn, wheat, soybean meal. That hasn't changed a lot. The overall level of spec shorts has moderated, but their attitude toward the ag markets still puts bearish pressure on prices. We see diesel supplies are tight this year. They're actually the second tightest of the past 10 years. Only 2022 had lower diesel supplies at this point in the season than we do right now. So that presents some concerns that those diesel prices might go up this fall. when farmers start to get in the fields. We're also seeing fertilizer prices a bit higher, about 10 to 15% higher roughly than they were a year ago. And that's, of course, a little tough to take when the grain prices are not higher than a year ago. Traders concerned about China's new crop soybean purchases this fall. We'll talk about that extensively. That's a big topic, and we'll have a lot to do with the prices that we see coming ahead of us, or the price opportunities. And then lastly, if there is one positive in all of this, when you get corn and soybeans this cheap, the one good thing is the demand has been very active, especially the domestic demand, but also export sales of corn have gone very good, and we'll get into that. So that's one thing that gives us a little hope for some better prices ahead when we get past the harvest period. The excuse me if I can. Okay. The in the big picture, I always like to take a look at the interest rates and the crude oil prices. There tends to be a strong correlation there, or explanation of what's happening. And basically, as we look at the 10-year T-note yield, it has not changed much over the past year and a half, sitting at 4.3%, fairly close to where those Fed fund rates are. We're not seeing much pressure up or down at the moment, so at least the interest rate picture has stabilized, and we don't see pressure of it going up more. Hopefully, there is some reasons for that interest rate yield to come down. As you see, the crude oil price overall, we've kind of chopped slowly lower on the crude oil level. Now we're down in the low 60s for spot crude oil prices. The U.S. is producing much better now. It's gotten its production back from the COVID interruption that it had. So we're much more stable in that situation. The Middle East continues to offer some concern, but has quieted down of late a bit. And lastly, we see a recent drop in the jobs data. Now, is that a short-term thing, or is there going to be more to it? That's the question. But if there is a slower growth, slower pace of economic growth ahead, that could help us give some room for the Fed to cut those interest rates and bring them down. And why is that important for the ag economy? Well, you know why, for a lot of reasons, but also in the markets. If the specs see the interest rates coming down, that could give them a little better view of investing back in the ag economy again, or at least in grains. Corn. Okay, the big question on everybody's mind, or ever since the report came out last Tuesday, is 188.8 bushel estimate for corn reasonable. And frankly, I don't like to see it yet in the August WASDE. I would have rather seen, if it's legitimate, I would have rather seen USDA wait to bring that big of an increase out in the September estimate, where at least they had some field data to back up what they're looking at. But USDA did what they did, and we have to take a look at it. This green line is the corn yield that we've seen over the past 25 years. The dotted trend line, obviously, on there is roughly the trend of the growth of that yield. And so we're at the 188.8 bushel estimate is 4% above trend. Is that reasonable? Well, we have had past years of good crops, as you can see on here. And in fact, in 2004, we had a time where the yield came in 11% above trend. So 4% above is not a crazy estimate. I'll put it that way. As again, I'll say I wish they would have held off on that until they got more confirmation in September. But they did what they did. And quite honestly, looking at all the weather data and everything John went over, and the input that Scott had on the yield models, it's very difficult for me, or I think anybody, to make too strong of an argument right now that this 180, almost 189 bushel estimate isn't legitimate. Of course, along with the 16.7 bushel crop estimate USDA came up with, they also increased corn acres from FSA data And I don't know if you saw, but this morning the University of Illinois put out a report saying that that looks legitimate. And not only that, corn acres, the corn planting this year may actually be 98 million acres, 97.3. If true, that's the biggest corn planting we've seen since 1933. And that's a lot of the heart of the problem that we're seeing with the price this year. Here is a chart I want to explain, but I think will help us understand a lot about what's happening in the corn market. The blue bars are prices of December corn divided by USDA's estimate of production costs. Now, USDA puts out a national estimate. Of course, those costs vary a lot from state to state and farm to farm. But this is the metrics that USDA gives us. So when we divide December corn price by the production cost, we can get a sense of how profitable the December corn price is. Now, keep in mind, December corn does not include the basis yet, which varies a lot also by the location you're in. So December corn looks more profitable than the actual market is in cash. But this is a good guideline for us to compare to previous years. And on this, I wanted to show that corn was 406 on yesterday's close. I understand we're trading a little lower this morning, about 403. But 406 was near 15% below USDA's production cost estimate, which you see by the far right blue bar. And if you notice, it's below the red dotted line, which is at the break-even point. So we're below production costs by 15% on this December corn price. The unusual thing is that the ending stocks to use ratio that USDA is predicting, even with this big 16.7 billion bushel crop, is 13%. Now, that that level of non-profitability is among the lowest readings we've seen in the post-ethanol era. And to have ending stocks estimated at 13% of annual use, yes, that's a comfortable supply situation for corn, but it's certainly not, say, what we would expect at these low price levels. I would expect, 15 to 20% if we're going to trade down this low on the December corn price. But unfortunately, I think maybe the interest rate situation has something to do with keeping the ag prices as depressed as they are. But we also have a very tough situation in soybeans and wheat, and those are not offering any profitability options at the time either. So right now, the market is really penalizing this modest or comfortable supply of corn in the market as we look at it historically. Here's some of the good news. Exports of corn, the shipments doing very well. As of August 7, over 2.5 billion bushels of old crop corn's been shipped. We're on pace for a record high 2.82 billion bushels in 24-25. That's not such a bad thing. Just 2 years ago, we really had a sharp drop off. Of course, we had a lot more expensive corn 2 years ago. That was part of the problem. Now that corn's under $4 cash, it's moving along quite briskly. The ethanol margin, fantastic. I mean, the ethanol plants are doing very well with this cheap of corn, obviously. The interesting thing to me is that when we look at the blue line, which USDA puts out, this is the value of processing corn. So it's the value of ethanol, corn oil, and distiller grains that you can get from 1 bushel of corn. And it comes out in the latest report to $5.98. That's $2.33 above where the national cash corn index from DTN is at 365. But if you notice that blue line, the processing value, it's stayed remarkably steady all summer long, even though corn prices were drifting lower from 450 now down into the mid $3 range. So the processing value of corn, the value to the world of corn's benefits is holding up very well, and that's keeping the ethanol production brisk. Unfortunately, in spite of record export sales and good exports, and I should also mention a good livestock market and a healthy livestock market for livestock producers, the basis in corn just is not faring well. It's at its eighth lowest or eighth weakest spot in 10 years. Nationally speaking, we're 40 cents below DTN's national corn index, excuse me, is 40 cents below the futures market for the basis. So those cash prices are getting hurt quite bad. As I say, that's the eighth weakest basis in 10 years. And it's basically a lot to do with the anticipation of a big upcoming harvest. The corn insurance math for 2025, well, we had February prices average 465 earlier this year. If you take into account a 5% yield increase and you have an 85% revenue protection plan, that puts your protection on the corn price down at 375. We're still above $4, so we're not really close to that yet this year. All right, let's take a look at soybeans, and a lot of this will also relate back to corn as I try to tie things together when we get toward the end here. But looking at the soybean chart, similar to what I showed for corn, this shows very unprofitable prices for soybeans. Again, last night we were at 1041. That's roughly 13% below USDA's production costs. This also some of the most unprofitable prices the soybean market has seen in the past 20 years. But supplies are relatively tight, even much tighter than corn. The ending stocks to use ratio is near 7%. Again, this is not a situation where just looking at the strict math of supplies, you would not expect the soybean price to be getting hit this hard with only a 7% ending stocks to use ratio. And of course, in the last week's report, the soybean acres were cut, harvested acres down to 80 million now. That's the lowest we've seen since 2019, back when we had the trade tariff negotiations and interruptions. I wanted to point out a previous time. If you look back at the early 2000s, now this is before China was a factor in the soybean market, but we had a big recession in the Asian economies and Russia, but mostly Asia, and a lot of our soybean customers were caught up in a currency crisis at the time, and the soybean prices really took it on the chin. At one point they were 40% below the cost of production for soybeans. It was a very, very tough 3 years. But if you notice, the ending stocks to use ratio was about 10 to 12% at the time. Now, to get hit 40% below cost in the early 2000s, you would have expected maybe a 20% at least ending stocks to use ratio, but that didn't happen. It stayed somewhat moderate around 10 to 12. And this just points out how emotional markets are and how much fear plays into pricing. And I think we're seeing that again today. We have a lot of concerns about what trade is going to look like with China. And I'll talk more about that just in a little bit here. Soybean exports this year, well, at least I can say they're up. The shipment pace is on track for a 10% gain in the old crop season, but it looks like the total is going to be about 390 million bushels less than the peak we experienced 4 years ago. So we're having a problem getting our soybean exports back ever since the last round of tariff and trade negotiations with China. Some hope for new crop soybeans. If you look at the price difference between the FOB soybean prices between Brazil and the U.S. Gulf for the month of September, we see that here at the U.S. Gulf, those soybeans are 87 cents a bushel cheaper versus Brazil. So that does give me some encouragement that yes, I do think China will eventually come to us for soybeans this fall, but I can't be confident on just how many soybeans. I think they're probably just going to take the minimal amount that they need to get by through the fall. And of course, a lot of how they respond to negotiations is going to depend on what South America's early crop conditions look like. So Brazil starts planting in September typically. if they're planning into a hot, dry situation, that could encourage more U.S. purchases from China. But if things look good, I think they're just going to hold to minimal amounts, and that's the overall concern. So far, China has not made any new crop purchases of U.S. soybeans, and our new crop total at the moment is down 20% from a year ago. Now it's still early, but we tend to have a very strong increase in purchases in September and October. So very soon we're going to be expecting to see more business. All I can say right now is the price is right. We're much cheaper than Brazil. China has bought a lot of soybeans from Brazil this year. And as you can see, it's really lifted their price in the month of August, where we're still on the lower end. The domestic demand for soybeans doing very good. Much like we saw with ethanol for corn, the processing value of soybeans here for the state of Illinois has held very firm and even has inched higher through the summer. Now $13.23 when you take the value of soybean oil and meal together, so they're getting much a big payoff for crushing those soybeans when they're only having to buy the soybeans at $9.78 on the cash level. So crush activity is up 5% in the old crop season and looks to continue to be doing well. It's encouraging to me that this is a good sign that the market for renewable diesel remains strong. And I think it's not only in the U.S., but I think it remains strong outside of the U.S. even more. And that's the good news for soybeans. The crop insurance math, like for corn, we're still trading well above where a crop insurance is probably offering your protection, depending on what policy or kind of policy you got. But the February price average for soybeans was 11.55. If we compute a 6% yield increase that USDA is estimating, it puts the revenue protection near 938 if you have an 85% plan in 2025. And yesterday's price was 1041. I think we're trading around 1031 shortly before I got on the call. So we're still well above where we could get some protection from crop insurance. Okay. If nothing else today, I want you to understand this chart, and I'll try to explain it here. The red line, first of all, is China's demand for soybeans. And as you can see, China was a quiet, rural agrarian nation largely before 2000, and then they started to grow, and they started to grow rapidly. They changed their policies, they freed things up, they allowed international investment to come in, and pretty soon they had higher standards of living and they wanted more protein in their supper plate. And to get that protein, they need soybean meal to feed livestock, chicken, poultry, and what have you, and pork. And so, as you can see, the demand for China's need for soybeans started escalating rapidly after the year 2000. Now, similar to that, Brazil was not much of a soybean producer before the year 2000, but with the growing market of China, obviously this was an opportunity that folks wanted to take advantage of, and Brazil started producing more soybeans. And exporting more soybeans. And the green line is Brazil's soybean exports. And then the black line is the U.S. soybean exports. And we had been the leading soybean exporter in the world for many, many years, and also started to benefit from China's new demand. And we were from about 2012 to 2017, we were splitting that market for China's demand with Brazil. And then, of course, as you know, the first round of tariff and trade negotiations with China came along. And ever since that time, Brazil's soybean exports have continued to expand while ours have fallen off. Now, China responded to those tariffs in 2018 by financing more expansion in Brazil. They continue to finance more expansion. Just this morning, the Wall Street Journal had a very interesting video about how much investment China is putting into building a new port in Santos. They're also investing in railroads, which will take their soybeans to Peru, which offers them a much shorter shipping distance in getting their soybeans to China. So there's a lot going on. China's been a big player in helping to finance that expansion. And as you can see, Brazil has increased their cropland aggressively for the past 15 years, and they've just got to a place where we could not keep up with them in terms of cropland anymore. So China's become increasingly dependent on Brazil, obviously on purpose, and they're more dependent on Brazil than ever, and less dependent on the U.S. than ever, and that's put us in a tough spot. And so this is where it's going to be very difficult for our soybean market to rebound enough. And the reason that we really needed that profitable soybean market was because we need to split those acres with corn at least. We've lost basically the profitability in the wheat market. We've lost wheat acres to corn and soybeans over the past couple decades, and now we're losing the potential of soybean acres sharing acres with corn. And so this is one of the first, well, second year that we're really getting hit on all three, and that's where the pressure's coming from, and that's what we're facing ahead of us. This is a very difficult situation, and I don't have an easy answer, but I can tell you that biofuels definitely are a possible lifesaver here. So to sum it up, the good news for producers is that domestic demand and corn exports are strong. They're keeping ending stocks at reasonable levels. 13% for corn is not outrageous. 7% for soybeans should be a profitable price. We're just not seeing it in the markets right now. The possibility of a slower economy next year and lower interest rates could have a supportive influence for grain prices. But the bigger factor really is going to be again, on weather and South American production. That's going to be the key to if we have any better winter opportunities for selling corn and beans or not. As I've mentioned before, biofuels remain vital for ag's future. We need those domestic markets to grow. And it's not just a domestic market. There are export opportunities that we get from that as well. But the biofuels are just absolutely vital. And I am glad to hear some talk of expanding E15, but we need to keep looking at more. What to do? Well, corn and soybeans were in a similar situation last year. I suggested that waiting at least until January because we get such a bearish pressure on our harvest prices, and especially when the crops are good, like it looks like they're going to be this year. Typically, you can start to see some better cash opportunities in January if you can hold off that long. And then by then, you'll also know just how things are starting out in South America. Last year, both corn and beans reached their highs in early February, while Brazil's weather was mostly favorable last year. So that turned out to be fairly good advice. I can't say it necessarily made you money, though, because even the highest prices last year were not always that great. With the 7% ending stocks to use ratio, soybeans have a better chance for price appreciation this winter, I would say, than corn does. But again, South American conditions will be the next major price influence after our harvest gets wrapped up or after we know more about how the harvest is going. So overall, surprises do happen. I can't deny the difficult market environment we're in, much like a year ago. I wish you the best for better days, and lower interest rates might help a bit. So not the best news, but I'm trying to help the best I can. I wish I could do a miracle. Katie, you probably have some questions.
That's right, Todd. We've got a couple in from the audience. I've got a whole little list of my own because that's what I do. I like to ask questions. You know, what you said there about this tough price environment for farmers out there. I'm starting to hear rumblings and some current concerns about operating loans for the upcoming year. Some folks with these high input prices, with crops not being there, farmers not wanting to sell off the combine. It's just going to be a tough season to get through this stretch.
Yes, and for a lot of years, we didn't have the high interest rates adding to the pain of trying to hold off on those sales. But then those operating loans are carrying a higher interest rate than they have for the last 2 years, and that just adds to the pain and the pressure, and so that makes it tough. This is a very, there's a convergence here of a lot of bearish factors coming in on the grain price, and so our producers definitely need some help.
Now, I want to bring John Baranick back in for this Q&A. Todd, you touched on something. I want to pull out a little bit on John's side as well before I get to the audience questions. John really kind of mentioned that the forecast looks a little dry for the rest of August, especially on that eastern half. We're talking about soybeans with a stocks to use ratio of around 7%. Todd, you mentioned potential price appreciation there. What's the likelihood we see this crop potential shrink on soybeans?
You know, I, I don't put a lot of stock into it, to be honest. And I have to admit, I'm jaded because I'm in eastern South Dakota. Katie, the rivers here are at the brim. The low areas in the fields have pools of water, so we've got a lot of yellow fields of corn and dead spots in the fields. Maybe not necessarily unusual for South Dakota and this kind of Glacier Lake area, but right now we don't want any more rain. We would love to see a dry fall harvest period. So we probably need someone better to speak up for the Illinois and Indianas and what they're seeing there.
John, tell me a little bit more about the rainfall in those areas. Could it maybe take something off those bean yields?
I think it could. I mean, especially with how many of those fields got planted late because of how wet it was in the spring. We still got a ways to go for some of those folks. And we're kind of getting into that, what normally is the August period for fill might be back a couple weeks even for some folks. So that's really going to be important. And yeah, I mean the forecast doesn't look great. And the soil moisture situation's So yeah, I could definitely see a drier pattern coming up, especially if we get the heat back in September. It's always hard this time of year because our average temperatures are falling with time now. So even above normal temperatures in September are like normal or even below normal temperatures in August. So it's hard to weigh all that together, but I could still see hot conditions coming back into September with the drier forecast still having an effect on those, especially those later bean fields. And a lot of those folks out there too do double cropping with wheat, so they're behind anyway. So I think there's still some time here for those, especially in the eastern half of the Corn Belt, to see their yield potential reduced because of the drier and potentially hotter forecast. Now, of course, over the next week, we're not going to have much heat, and we're kind of getting rid of that now and then getting that blast of cold air. But yeah, if we get that heat to return and it stays drier and we don't see a whole lot of rainfall between now and say the end of September, I could definitely see those yields coming down a bit.
You mentioned that blast of cold air, and I want to get to a question from Kent up in Canada. He wants to know what the forecast is looking like for Western Canada over the next 6 to 8 weeks, what that harvest looks like. You mentioned potentially not really ruling out, but not high odds of an early frost in the Dakotas. But what about up in Canada?
Yeah, and I know I should have known Kent was going to be on the call. So sorry, Kent, I should have put something in there about Canada. But the frost risk is more towards Manitoba, I think. And it's really where that upper level high just kind of sits. And it looks like Saturday or Sunday morning has the best potential there. Probably 30s, but it's so hard to get frost even up that far north in August. So it's non-zero, but I don't put a whole lot of stock in it. The forecasts though are up in the 40s, and it's like, I think it could come down from there. But when you look at the western half of the prairies, in terms of the next 6 weeks or so, I think they're going to follow all along with a lot of the same ideas that we were talking about for here. So I mean, the next 2 weeks is going to be a little chillier, especially in the eastern half. Western half might be a little bit more shielded from the chilly temperatures. But as we get through September, I think it's going to be again a little bit more of an active month of weather. We have above normal temperatures for that, so that's good for harvest, but we also have above normal precipitation as well. So that just screams to me a lot of systems moving through, a lot of active weather. potential for some high winds if we've got some big systems moving through. So that could knock some things down if we're, stuck on the sidelines waiting for things to dry out a little bit. I'm a little up and down in September wouldn't be all that great for harvest, honestly. So we'll have to watch out for some heavy rainfall events if we get some of those bigger systems to move through as well. So kind of a lot of stuff probably going on up there. Doesn't mean that that's going to completely wash away, half the harvest or anything like that. That's not going to happen. But some issues up there I could definitely see happening.
Well, the next question I've got here from the audience is for Todd. It's really, what do you think what would it take to get grain prices back up out of these sort of doldrum to depressing levels?
Boy, well, again, we have to find it's going to take some political support, honestly. The way the market looks right now, I don't see any big influence where the market can do it by itself. And of course, weather is the only thing that has to do with that. So we need a better plan as to what to do with our surplus crops, and we just really haven't dealt with that. And again, I'm saying as we're losing the wheat crop overall, we've given up a lot of those acres to corn and beans. And now we're at risk of losing our soybean market and the weight's all falling on corn. So we really need someone to understand that this on a national political basis. And unfortunately, I don't see either party really grasping the issue or offering any solutions other than thank goodness for our biofuel proponents, because that is the one positive that can help at least both corn and beans. And we need a new alternative use for wheat or better use of the surplus wheat we have.
But if I could interject a little bit,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, Katie, about
Go
the
ahead, John.
weather, because South America is basically where all our competition is going, right, Todd? So
Yeah.
a big weather issue down there would certainly help. Now they've been able to kind of get by some bad weather problems in both Argentina and Brazil for the last several years. But we saw, shoot, I forget when it was now. It probably, Todd, you remember better if it was 21 or 22 when they had the big frost down there and they had the big dry spell, and things went great for us, for them
Yes.
having such bad yields. That was a La Nina year. And so, I mean, we've had a lot of La Nina years here recently that they've been able to get through. But if we have another big delay to the start of their wet season, like a big one, and it's very short again next year, we could get some help from the weather gods for South America to kind of shorten that up a bit. But I think that's what it would take, right, Todd? I mean, otherwise, I mean, they've got so many acres and so much surplus down there that they can withstand some issues with weather.
Yeah, absolutely right. We did see a very nice bump in our exports that 21-22 season and 2021, obviously, which helped out from Brazil weather. But keep in mind that that helps buy us a little time. But in the meantime, they continue to expand their cropland base. So that's really digging a big hole for us.
Yeah, we can't count on a big weather event every year, right?
If only we could.
Yeah, and what the models you showed earlier showed that, even La Nina might be a little bit short-lived here. So I don't know how much of an impact that would have.
Right.
Yeah.
But even a small contracted La Nina could have big issues, especially for that soybean crop, which is where I think we might want to have those issues be more pronounced, would be with that rather than the corn. So if we can get some big massive delays to the start of their wet season, I guess we can cross our fingers. And that's coming up shortly here too. I mean, the start of their wet season is at the end of September. So it's not that far away. We're gonna have to start looking at that very closely here coming up.
Bring it on, John. We need it.
And I guess that gets into, will China buy soybeans from the US this year? Are they going to hold that as a playing card in the trade talks and tariff talks? Because if they can get what they need from South America, they might go that way.
Yeah. And my bias is that whatever political differences, China is practical in the sense that if they need soybeans, they will buy them. I just don't think they'll buy any more than they need. And that is becoming less and less every year. So that's very tough.
Especially since we have a short export window to them before
Yeah.
Brazil has their next crop come online.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The question I was going to ask you, Todd, was a little bit more on the biofuel side. Have you seen much changes in the renewable diesel or the sustainable aviation fuel side and any movement there? Is that kind of stalled out in Washington?
You know, it's sustainable aviation fuel for corn and bean guys. I would just set that off to the side. I don't really see that corn and beans have a future the way the SAF laws are being written so far. And, I would love to be wrong on that, but I don't see a lot of room for corn and beans in the SAF. On the renewable diesel, I was very encouraged this year to see the soybean oil price hold up as well as it did and hold up the crush values, which is the more important number. Uh, it was nice to see those hold up this summer as well as they did because, California's made moves to start reducing some of their footprint in the renewable diesel market. But keep in mind, outside of the US is where there is an even bigger interest in renewable diesel because it promises the hope of being a locally sourced fuel that a lot of countries can afford. And diesel is what makes the country work. It runs the big rigs that do all the big jobs. And we don't really have any great alternatives for those types of big rigs yet. So renewable diesel still looks very hopeful to me on a worldwide basis, and we still benefit from that.
But it'll just take time to bring all that production and that capacity online.
Yeah, of course.
So not a savior for this crop year or maybe even the next.
No, these are not magic bullets, but it's the type of thinking and opportunities we need to give our kids and grandkids an opportunity in ag.
And you were talking, John, a little bit about this weather forecast for the fall being a little bit hot and dry on some of that eastern side of the Corn Belt. But you threw in the caveat of, it's hurricane season. Hurricanes could change some things. What's that season looking like it's going to shape up to be? Are we looking for an active one? Are we looking for a lot of development in the Gulf? What does the DTN meteorology team see on that?
When we started the season, well, when we were looking back in the spring and we were looking at kind of what the conditions were looking like this summer, we thought we would have kind of an early start to it. And we've had a couple of tropical storms that have been close, but nothing major. They've been very small and haven't done much. Aaron's the first real hurricane of the season. Waiting until mid-August is a little late, honestly, for that. Usually we have our first hurricane in the beginning of August on average. So we're a little bit late on that. But I mean, as long as it's interesting for the next couple of months, we're actually going to be looking at Africa, and a lot of the thunderstorms that happen over Africa, if they grow into these big clusters, they move off into the Atlantic, where they form these tropical waves, and they have a long time to go across the Atlantic before they run into trouble going across land. So, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity there as long as Africa stays active, and right now, at least for the next couple of months, Africa does look like it's going to stay fairly active. I don't need to go into the meteorology, I guess, on it, but it does look like we'll have many more opportunities in the pipeline going forward. But that's just typical for this time of year. I mean, this is peak hurricane season, so Africa is usually pretty active this time of year and sending those tropical waves westward through the Atlantic. So. The big reason why we thought we were going to get a whole bunch of them is that usually we see the upper level shear reduced during neutral or even La Nina conditions. And so we've been in that, and we're heading into a La Nina, it looks like. So we would expect those upper level conditions to be a little bit more conducive for producing them as well. So, even though we got a little bit of a late start, we're still predicting a near or even slightly above average hurricane season. It doesn't mean that it's going to be that way or hit the US necessarily, but it's something obviously we're going to have to watch. And, there's no reason to believe that it's going to be kind of a below normal season this year. So, yep, always going to have to watch it. And those are always the things that we just cannot predict more than a week out, really. So we'll just have to keep watching it.
All right. Well, I see we've answered all of the questions from the audience today. I want to give you each, Todd and John. Let's maybe start with John and then go to Todd. Just some final thoughts, some parting comments for our audience, what they need to be watching out for this year. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I mean it's been hard to deny the really good weather across the bulk of the Corn Belt this year. It's the reason why our numbers are so high, why other areas are also seeing very high numbers. It doesn't matter really where you go. I don't think anybody's producing anything below trend line. So there's been no reason to deny that. But there's also still part of the season yet to go. And we talked a little bit about the Eastern Corn Belt, especially with having the ability to have some more of those issues once those combines start rolling. But I mean, it's tough to say. I mean, Iowa's just had beautiful weather. The number on that is astronomical. I think ours is a massive record, if I'm not mistaken, if that turns out to be true. So it's going to be interesting to see how all that comes together. Do the issues in the Eastern crop or Corn Belt crop up? Pun intended, or does everything just kind of out west outweigh it this year? And it'll be interesting to see from a meteorological perspective, at least. I don't know, Todd, how that works for you and the market prices and everything.
Yeah, well, I just hope everybody has a good harvest season here. It's tough enough when you're facing low prices and all of that, and at least it does take a little of the weight off to get some good yields and to get the corn there. So at least you have the corn and the beans to sell, and that does help bring the production costs down a little bit. But we understand this is not an easy market environment. There are not easy choices that are going to be probably this winter. But again, a lot of it comes down to what's happened in Brazil and Argentina. Keep your eyes on that. Pay close attention to John, as I always did when I was at DTN. Big help, and to Bryce before John. So a lot of it is going to be weather, and that's usually where the surprises come from, but you never know. Surprises are surprises, and there's a lot of unexpected things that come out of these somewhat dark bear market periods. So just keep the antenna up for that.
All right. Well, with that, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We had a really interesting conversation throughout our whole presentation today, our discussion of DTN's yield models, the weather, the markets. I want to remind you all in the chat, there's a link to where you can go to sort of get a first look at some of the new DTN products that are going to be coming out, our new website for our news content that will eventually include some of those yield models and those operational features that we're really excited to introduce to people. So you can learn more by going and checking out that link in the chat. And then I just want to echo what Todd and John said. Please, be safe this harvest season. You might have a good window. You might have to wait and go, but please, safety is paramount. Start there. And with that, I want to wish you all a safe, healthy, prosperous harvest. Thank you for joining us. Have a good day.